Hello, this is a free seminar hosted by West Suffolk College exploring archetypal psychology with me, Robin Hearn. So in terms of what this seminar will cover and explore, we'll look at some of the basic ideas that were advanced by Carl Jung and how they built upon some earlier concepts from other people. And then as we go exploring the ideas of Jung, we'll introduce ideas from various of his followers and students, people who have picked up where he left off after his death, and try to apply those ideas to daily life. Now, whether you are perhaps a counsellor or a therapist, or you're considering that as a career option, or you're simply somebody who is interested in the ideas of Carl Jung, being able to apply these ideas to everyday life is quite a useful thing to do, particularly given that Jung's ideas are at times very abstract and somewhat rarefied. So a practical application, a day-to-day application, is a useful avenue to go down. This is the man himself, Carl Jung, born in Switzerland, and in 1906 became a student of Freud, having explored his ideas and become inspired by them, enamored of them. He became part of Freud's inner circle and remained so for the next 6 years. In fact, Carl Jung was regarded as something of a sort of a golden boy, the surrogate son, as it were, of Sigmund Freud. And they were intensely close to each other, devoted to each other in many respects, until the huge rift that came in 1912, when they never spoke again. It does have to be said that Freud had a number of falling outs with various different people with whom he never spoke again. This is a consistent pattern in Freud's life. So not unique to Jung, although the scale of the falling out was perhaps more intense with Jung than it was with any of the various other people. So Jung built on some of the ideas from Freud, notions like the unconscious sleeping mind, which Freud said we all have. In fact, Freud said our waking conscious minds are the smaller part of our psychological condition. The vast bulk of our self, of our very existence, is conducted at an unconscious sleeping level. And this unconscious self communicates with the conscious mind through the imagery and symbolism of dreams, of literature, of heightened imagination, and so forth. So Jung took that idea and expanded upon it to incorporate his notion of the collective unconscious, which is the sense that not only do we each have our own individual unconscious minds, but that all of these minds of every single person alive on the planet at the moment patches into each other, and indeed into the minds of all the people who have ever existed in the history of the world. That all of those human minds, millions, in fact billions and billions and billions by now, have layered experience, thought, emotion, cognition, ideas, dreams, worries, hopes, all of the rest of it, layer upon layer upon layer, until it has formed a pattern that exists within this vast uber mind of humanity, and within which we all participate. And this is one of the reasons why both Freud himself and then later Jung were intensely interested not only in dream analysis, but in things like astrology and alchemy and Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, and so forth. All different ways of communicating ideas in a very artistic, very symbolic, very metaphorical way, where big ideas can be conveyed in a comparatively simple symbol and grasped at an intuitive level. So within this collective of unconsciousness, there exist what Sigmund Freud thought of as these dominant patterns, and which Carl Jung developed and evolved into the notion of archetypes. Now, the notion of archetypes or dominant patterns, it was unique neither to Freud nor to Jung, but stemmed from much earlier philosophies and thinkings one of which is the philosophies of the Greek thinker Plato. Now, Plato argued that there was two levels of reality: the physical material level in which most of us live and operate on a day-to-day basis, and then the abstract level, the realm of forms. Now, the realm of forms is this sort of spiritual dimension of existence in which the ideal template that forms the core of the various things we can see around us in the physical world originates. So in this ideal world, there is an ideal dog, a form of dog. And this captures the very essence, the very core of what it means to be a dog. And every single dog you might see in the world today, or have ever seen in the world at some point in the past, is a manifestation of this essential dog. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Chihuahuas or Great Danes or anything in between. No matter how big or tall, hairy or short-haired or wire-haired or any other combination, all of these endless variations on a theme are exactly that, variations on a theme, and the theme is what Plato referred to as the form, the essence of dog. Now, this is not simply true of dogs and elephants and zebras and any other creature you care to imagine. It's true of humanity. And it is true of the things that humanity creates. So when somebody creates a chair, somebody makes a chair, they are producing a chair out of their imagination. They dream up a chair and sketch it out on a piece of paper and then make it out of wood or whatever particular material they're making it out of. Where does that idea of a chair come from? Well, Plato says it comes from the realm of forms, from this abstract metaphysical region of which humanity partakes through dreams and imagination and so forth. So the carpenter designing the chair gets the vision of the chair from the very essence, the form of chair. And every single chair you could possibly ever see or sit upon that exists today in the world or ever has existed at some point in the past in the world is a manifestation, a variation on the essence of chair. So it's not simply living beings, it's practically anything you care to think of can be understood as having this fundamental spiritual essence to it that defines what it is. And it's remarkably hard for us as humans to pin this down. To think of every conceivable breed of dog there is in the world and to consider what it is that all of these breeds of dog have in common. So no matter how much variation you get in terms of height and weight and coloration and muzzle shape and all of the rest of it, no matter how much variation there is, fundamentally, all dogs share a core. So you would have to come up with a definition of dog if you were trying to engage in this at an intellectual level rather than a spiritual one. A definition of dog which incorporates every conceivable variation and still allows for the Chihuahua, the Great Dane, the Husky, the Basset Hound, and every other permutation on the breed to have all of their differences and individualities and peculiarities and yet still be a dog and identifiably a dog in such a way as you could distinguish it from a cat, from a mouse, from an elephant, from a shark. You could say no matter what similarities some creatures have in common, there are certain individual distinctions and essences that identify them and make them uniquely of that species and not some other species. And this really becomes the bedrock of Jung's argument that there are these core essences, these core drives, these fundamental forms and shapes that define critical experiences in life. Now, Jung was not particularly interested in the essence of dog or the essence of budgerigar or the essence of chair or table or what have you. Jung's fascination for archetypes comes with the idea that there are key experiences which are central to all human beings upon the planet. And these shared experiences are like different dog breeds, variations on a central key experience, variations on a theme. That theme, that essence, that form is the archetype, the bedrock of the experience. Now, to give you a very straightforward, obvious example, Jung wrote extensively about the Great Mother. He says, just about every ancient religion you care to imagine, and many still surviving religions around the world, has central within its pantheon of gods and goddesses a mother figure. There is Gaia, Mother Earth to the Greeks. There is Frigga, the wife of Odin in Scandinavian and Germanic mythology. Isis, the pharaoh's chief wife in Egyptian mythology, goddess of the moon and of magic. Within Catholicism, there is the Virgin Mary. You can point to figure after figure after figure in the religions and the storytelling traditions, the myths, the legends, the great tales from around the world, and find mother figures. Why is this? Well, Jung says they are all variations on that central theme of the Great Mother. Everyone has a mother. Now, even if someone's mother died perhaps giving birth to them, so they never had a memory of her, a knowledge of her, because she's died before their memories are formed, nonetheless they will have had a mother and probably have heard stories from other relatives and what have you about their mother, and they will form an image in their head of what they imagine their mother looks like, possibly based upon photographs, or even if there are no photographs, maybe we're going back to a period of history before there were photographs, or someone who simply, family never had access to a camera in the first place. Even where there's no visual stimuli, nonetheless people will imagine what they think their mother looked like. And whether it's a direct lived experience of someone who physically knows their mother, or whether it's a more imaginal experience of this idealized mother, nonetheless there is this ongoing experience of motherhood. And of course, countless billions of women over the course of history have had direct experience of being a mother, of being pregnant, of giving birth, of raising and looking after children. So you have the combination of both those men and women who have had a mother and those women who have been a mother. And these billions upon billions of experiences over the course of human history layer like sediment to form rock. They layer one upon top of the other, the good experiences and the bad, those who loved their mothers, those who hated their mothers, those who were largely indifferent to their mothers. All of those experiences constellate, conjoin to form this global human experience of motherhood. And that is an archetype. The Great Mother is only one archetype. There are numerous other archetypes, some of which we'll touch upon as we go. But all humans will participate in experiencing the archetype, contributing towards it and being shaped and formed by it. That's simply the nature of reality, the nature of life, of experience. Now, what are these other archetypes that are around? Well, there's a set of 12 here, but there are others that can be thought of. I don't propose to go over all of this set of 12 because this seminar will end up 10 times longer than initially planned for. But to give you a flavour of this, and if you do have any questions, you can always email me about specific ones you're interested in. And if there's enough interest, I can put together some future seminar going into more depth than one or two or three particular archetypes. But we'll take one or two and illustrate them a little bit to give you an idea of how these work. Now, these 12 are not unique and isolated and cut off from one another. They form part of a pattern, a little bit like performers in a stage play. They each come on and go off and have their turn up on the stage. And as individuals, if we live long enough in the course of a life, depending on how old you live to be, we can all participate in most, if not indeed every single one of these 12, both in terms of encountering other people who seem to embody one or more of these archetypes, and participating within them ourselves as enactors of the archetype. So, for example, the caregiving role is a maternal nurturing sort of a role. Every one of us at some point will have been looked after by somebody else. When we were very young, or when we've been very ill, or had various other experiences where we have required the help, the support, the nurture of another human being. Whether that was a family member, a friend, a paid professional, a passing stranger in the street, someone or another has taken on the role of caregiver towards us. Maybe they've done it very well, or maybe they've done it very badly, who can say, but they have done it nonetheless. And equally, just as we've been on the receiving end, if we live long enough, at some stage we will be on the giving end. We will be the one to show care and nurture concern for others, to look after them. That could be looking after our pets. It could be looking after our children if we have them, or elderly relatives if we have them. That could be a job looking after strangers. There can be a whole variety of ways in which we may seek to give care and nurture to others. And we may do so very effectively, we may be very good carers, or we may be really rather poor at the job and actually create more problems than we cure. But nonetheless, whether it goes well or goes badly, we are participating in that archetypal expression. And part of the archetype is all of the generations of people in the past who have given us some notion, some idea of what it means to be a carer. How do you care for someone? Who is it appropriate to care for? Who is it inappropriate to care for? And that will change according to culture and periods of history. So in some parts of the world, if a woman is in need of care, it would only be considered appropriate for the care to be provided by another woman. And if a man is in need of care, it would only be considered appropriate for it to be provided by another man. Whereas in other parts of the world and other points in the history, it wouldn't necessarily matter the relationships of gender involved. There are periods of history where it's perhaps more of a social class, where those lower down the social hierarchy provide care as servants and helpers and so on to those higher up the social hierarchy, but it would not perhaps necessarily be expected to go in the other direction. So whilst the servant might look after the lord of the manor, there would never be an expectation that the lord of the manor would look after the servant, or at least if they did so, it would not be in the same way. It might be perhaps to provide financial support to the servant when they become ill, but not to feed them or pat their fevered brow or what have you. So there will be different rules and regulations in different cultures, different periods of history, as to what is and what is not an appropriate manifestation of care. We'll have a brief look at another archetype to give you a little bit more of a flavour. The magician is a recurrent image in every culture upon the planet. It's difficult to think of a culture which doesn't have stories of wizards and witches and magical people who have strange, mysterious powers that can do wondrous things. Whether that's by chanting mysterious words or waving their wand, or indeed if we want to bring it into a sort of a modern day scientific context, when we might imagine falsely to ourselves that magic is no longer a central feature of many people's lives in the 21st century. It is, but we might pretend to ourselves it's not if we're terribly rationalist. Take a figure of fiction, somebody like Doctor Who, who can do amazing, wonderful things and change face and travel the galaxy and go back and forth in time, and who solves problems by whipping out a sonic screwdriver, which may be presented as a scientific gizmo with flashing lights, but if we're being Jungian, is really little bit more than a wizard's wand, by which Doctor Who can make amazing things happen. That's his wand. So we can understand that whether it's in a modern scientific setting or a traditional setting of robes and pointed hats and wizards' wands, the figure of the magician persists throughout time and is very alluring, even down to modern day films, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, films and books that have such a vast appeal to humanity that millions upon millions of people buy them, translated into every imaginable language going, because people want to participate in these worlds of magic and imagine themselves as having powers. And it may well be that we look at other people who can do things we can't, and it feels like magic. Even if it isn't, we nonetheless see it as being like magic in all sorts of different ways, and it inspires us. What does a magician do? Well, a magician leaves a mark upon the world. Hence, that splitting of this set of 12 phenomena into groups of 4. Jung was very keen on putting things into groups of 4. Seems to have been his favourite number, and it repeats in various different capacities. This particular group of 4, the outlaw, the magician, and the hero, all seek to leave their mark upon the world, usually for the better. The good wizard, the brave outlaw of the Robin Hood variety, the dashing hero, like all of those figures of Greek myth, seeks to make the world a better place, so that when they finally shuffle off the mortal coil, the world is better for their having been in it. And we all want to do that to some extent. We all want to make the world a nicer, better place. Or do we? Because some people, perhaps having failed to make the world a better place, decide that they will make their mark upon it through destruction and sadism and cruelty and doing terrible things. So if they cannot be loved, then they will be feared. And that's how they will make their mark. That's how they will exercise their power, which is one of the key features of the magician. And putting aside all of what Robert Louis Stevenson referred to as the hugger-mugger of mysticism and pseudoscience, every one of us has some sort of power, some sort of capacity to change the lives of other people. Whether we do it for better or for worse, we are leaving our mark. We are exercising our power. We have made something happen that would not have happened had we not been there. And so from childhood onwards, we're beginning to learn what our power is. We find out what our power is. We find out what our skills, our talents, our abilities to make a mark on the world are. How do those talents manifest? Because my ability to make a mark upon the world will be different from your ability to make a mark upon the world. So we each find our own way of doing it, our own particular format to express power, and we engage in it to greater or lesser extent. It's an interesting process in which we seek to be remembered fundamentally, to be recalled in some shape, form, or guise. And all of these 12 can be understood as a journey which every single person takes over the course of their life if they live long enough to get through all 12. So it's both an internal description of the individual, of the passage of life, but we can also see the passage of human history. We can see individual civilizations grow from a state of innocence through understanding and freedom and liberation and so forth, going through all of these 12. We could see organizations, schools, colleges, businesses, churches, synagogues, mosques, any kind of an institution going through a process of change, through a process of stages, encountering these experiences both within itself, but also in its interaction with the wider surrounding world. So this can be understood at a multiple set of layers, and it will impact us in different ways. So I, as an individual, will have my own experience of one of these stages, but the college I work for will also have its collective experience of these different stages. And the religious group I attend will have its experience of these different stages. So there will be one person, I can be in a multitude of groups, as you indeed can be in a multitude of groups, and each group can be at a different stage, and the individual within those groups can be at different stages. So there's hundreds of wheels spinning, and we have an experience of all sorts of different wheels spinning at different times in our lives, and where we fit into these spinning wheels. Brief practical exercise for you. I'll describe what you could do, and then if you would like, pause the video, go make yourself a cup of tea, engage in the exercise, and when you're ready, come back and play the rest of this recording. You don't have to do the exercise if you don't want to. You could just skip on, but there's the option there for you. So if you would like to do the exercise, close your eyes and then think of somebody you know. This could be a person in your life at the moment. It could be somebody who used to be in your life at some time in the past, or it could be an entirely fictional character, someone out of a novel or off the television or in a film, radio play, whatever. Someone who you find so galling, so annoying, so horrible and unpleasant that given the opportunity, you'd quite like to smack them one. Now, even if you're a pacifist and you wouldn't actually do it, you nonetheless have the urge there. You have to struggle with yourself not to thump this person because they are so unpleasant. When you thought of that person, some face has leapt to your mind. Find some scrap paper and a pen and write down all of the things about them that really, really annoy you, that drive you to absolute frustration. Why it is you'd really, really, really like to thump this person. They're so awful. Now, if you restart the video, what has this to do with Jung? Well, Jung would suggest that this person who so gets under your skin is an echo of your own shadow. Now, the shadow is one of the archetypes. The shadow is the part of ourselves we keep in darkness, that's hidden. And often when we're very young, it's not so much that we keep it in darkness, but rather, initially at least, our parents, our carers, push that part of us into darkness. Because when you're very, very young, you don't necessarily know which bits of you should be dark and which bits of you should be light. So why is it in darkness? It's a bit of you in darkness because you're told that part of yourself is in some way wrong, inappropriate, not the kind of behavior your parents expect you to engage in public. Could be a toddler having a temper tantrum, screaming, shouting, throwing things, smashing things. Inappropriate behavior. And anger often does form part and parcel for many, many people of the shadow from an early age. But it may, of course, be other things. It depends on your culture. It depends on your family. It depends on individual experiences that happen to you as you get older. This is one of the areas of rift that occurred between Freud and Jung. Freud was fixated, you might say, very centered on the first 5-6 years of a child's life, and said that everything that happens to the child after that is filtered through the lens of those first 5-6 years. Jung said the early years were important. However, he said things that happen to us later in life, when we're 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, are just as important as what happens to us in the first 5 years, and can reroute, change, have a radical impact on the growing mind, upon the adult mind. So it's not just early childhood, it's an ongoing thing. So, for example, somebody might grow up in a family which is very, very sporty, which frowns upon bookishness or being artistic and considers it all a bit mamby-pamby and stupid and boring and ridiculous. And so the one child in the family who is very artistic or is very bookish is encouraged to keep their bookishness or their artisticness under wraps in order to please their parents, their brothers, their sisters, and to pretend perhaps to be a lot more sporty than they really are. Or vice versa, it could be a very arty family that frowns on sport and has the sporty child who keeps their competitive edge under wraps and pretends to be more creative than they are. So it can go in all sorts of different directions. But essentially, it's the bit of ourselves we learn to hide. Now, along with the temper tantrums of tiny children, sexuality, which is an area Freud would have agreed with, often becomes part of this, as we are taught the notion of inappropriate body parts. Perhaps a toddler might be allowed to run around the house naked, and parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents and so on just laugh and think it's sweet. Would they still be comfortable when that child is 16 and running around the house naked? Probably not. So we develop the idea as we get older that we reach a certain age where it's no longer deemed appropriate to show certain parts of our body, at least not in public, and then even maybe not in the family home, maybe only in the bathroom or only here or only there. And we learn an element of shame. It doesn't have to be scathing levels of shame, but simply a sense that it is not appropriate to do this particular activity in that particular venue. Therefore, we have to keep this particular activity a little bit hidden. But of course, for many families, many individuals, the shame becomes very pronounced. That certain things are dirty or disgusting or sinful, wicked in some way. And so if the child or teenager, whatever age they may be, has those urges or wants to engage in those activities, they probably wouldn't tell their parents about it. They might keep it hidden away, keep it under wraps for fear of what the family would say or fear of what the neighbours would say, or embarrassment if the other kids at school found out. And so they may continue to pursue certain activities or have certain dreams, fantasies, whatever, but do it in a very secretive way. The more repressive the family is, the more censorious they are, the deeper those parts of the personality get driven into the shadows, into the darkness of the unconscious personality. And so they become seen as at least embarrassing, possibly sinful, and perhaps even pronouncedly evil. Collective notions of evil form part of the shadow. So we have both our individual shadow as a person, as an isolated individual, but we also have a shadow collectively. We grew up in a culture that says certain things are wicked and wrong. Now, we as an individual may or may not agree with society. We may think society is correct, or we may think society is prudish and old-fashioned. But we will at least be aware of what the bulk of people in the society we live in regard as wicked, and be acutely conscious of what happens to people who engage in wicked activities. And that will chop and change from culture to culture, from century to century. So Britain in the Victorian age was very censorious of homosexuality. In the 21st century, not so much. Some countries around the world are still very, very censorious of homosexuality. In some parts of the world, again, Victorian times, we'll stick with that, a young girl getting pregnant out of wedlock, seen as sinful, wicked, embarrassing, and quite a few middle-class young girls who got pregnant out of wedlock were confined to psychiatric asylums, diagnosed as nymphomaniacs. And some of them stayed there for decades, under the perception that they were not safe to let out. These days, of course, it's a commonplace occurrence, and very few people would bat an eyelid about it. But equally, in the 21st century, As we can see, particularly in the last few weeks, when it's become very pronouncedly prominent, there are many people around the world who regard racism as wicked and terrible and awful and appalling. Whereas 100 years ago, hardly anyone would have given it a second thought. And saying unpleasant things about people with a different skin colour or from a different nationality would have been a commonplace thing. No one would have batted an eyelid at, really. So what one era or one culture considers wicked and appalling, another might consider perfectly humdrum and normal. So our shadow is not only shaped by the individual family and situation we grew up in, but also by the collective culture that we grew up in. And what we are told is part and parcel of the darkness. What has to be kept under wraps is considered inappropriate, shocking, outrageous, dangerous, dark. Now, does this mean everyone you dislike is a reflection of your shadow? No. What Freud and Jung both agreed upon was that intensity of dislike is the key here. Simply finding someone rude or unpleasant or nasty in some way is just an ordinary everyday reaction. However, if you find that person so offensive, so galling, that it becomes a struggle to control your own temper when you're around them, it is that intensity of reaction, Freud argued, Jung argued, is suggestive that this person in some way reminds you too much of your own shadow. There's something about them, something they do or they say, which is too much like what that dark side of you wants to do or say. And so you resent in them the thing you resent or fear in yourself. But it is that intensity of reaction that's the critical giveaway, that there is more going on to this dislike, this hatred, than simply someone who's a bit rude or a bit nasty or has done you wrong in some way. It's the intensity. Having identified it, what do you then do? Well, Jung says you must seek to reintegrate it. You must accept that you have a shadow side. We all do. Even the sweetest, loveliest, kindest person in the world has a shadow side to them. And so we have to accept that we have a dark side, all of the people we love have a dark side, all the people we dislike have a dark side. We're usually quite good at accepting that one. And all those random strangers we pass in the street and don't much care about have a dark side. That dark side will be more manageable if we know it's there. If I know what my darkness is, I can manage it. If I don't know what it is, or I'm so repressed to my own nature, I'm unwilling to admit to it, then I cannot control what I won't admit to being there in the first place. Now, this is about admitting things to yourself, not running up to total strangers in the street and telling them. Whether or not you tell anyone else is really besides the point. It's, do you know in and of yourself when you look in the mirror what your own failings are? What horrible things you've done or been tempted to do? Once you know it's there, you can start to understand why it's there, how it developed, what triggers it off, what causes it to flare up from being mildly unpleasant to really quite dangerous. That process of self-awareness is part of the maturation that Jung felt we should all aspire to, if we live long enough to aspire to it. That's what makes for a better rounded, healthier, more balanced individual, that self-awareness and self-control. That's what we're aiming for. But knowledge is the first step in self-control. It's not the end of it, it's just the first step. But you've got to start with the first step before you can get to the second, the third, the fourth step. Now, one thing worth bearing in mind is that acknowledging the darkness doesn't make it go away. Because there are some self-help books, therapy books, that sort of thing, that have this rather naive notion that if you accept your inner darkness, somehow it all magically changes, and rather like those mythological stories and the fairy tale stories that Jung so loved, if you kiss the frog, it turns into a handsome prince. That's not necessarily the case. The darkness stays dark. It's just that you're in better control of it, in better understanding of it. So it's not automatically going to turn into something lovely. Now, the quote here from Ira Stone, back in 1988, Ira Stone was a Jungian. In ancient Greece, there was an understanding that one was required to worship all the gods and goddesses. You might have your favourite, but none of the remaining deities could be ignored. The god or goddess whom you ignored became the one who turned against you and destroyed you. Now, as far as we know, the people of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, ancient Britain, and all the other countries were polytheists. They believed in their gods and goddesses as wholeheartedly as Christians believe in God and Muslims believe in Allah and so forth today. So far as we know, they didn't sit around regarding them as Jungian archetypes. Well, they're certainly not Jungian because they'd never heard that word. It didn't exist then. Whether you today want to regard gods and goddesses and other figures of religion as real or as metaphors or as something else entirely is down to you. I'm not going to get involved in those sorts of discussions in this seminar. Suffice to say, we'll look at these stories as Jungians understand them. That's not to say the pagans of ancient Greece understood them in the way that modern-day Jungians understand them. Now, one particular story I want to put to you here as very illustrative of Ira Stone's quote is the story of Hippolytus. This was a myth eventually turned into a play. The myth runs that Hippolytus was a young prince who was very enamored of sport. He loved to ride horses, he loved to go hunting in the forests, and all of the sort of manly sports that ancient Greek princes did, and was devoted in his worship to the goddess Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, who is also the virgin goddess. So devoted to her that it was to the exclusion of all other deities, which, as you'll remember from Stone's quote, is a risky thing to do. Have your favourites, but don't ignore the others. Well, that's exactly what Hippolytus messed up on. He had his favourite and he ignored all of the others. And one particular deity whom he ignored intensively was the goddess Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire and passion. Because Hippolytus was celibate. He had no interest in beautiful young women. Equally, he had no interest in beautiful young men, which for an ancient Greek prince was very odd. He wanted nothing to do with sex or relationships or romance or any of it. And so he made no offerings before the temple of Aphrodite, made no offerings to her altar. Now, offerings in this sense can be understood both as burning incense, saying prayers, pouring wine on the altar, but also to fall in love is an offering to the goddess Aphrodite, just as to play music is an offering to the god Apollo. There are a whole raft of activities which were understood as being under the remit of this or that deity, and so to engage in those activities consciously was to give honour to that god or that goddess. And so by being celibate, he's not only not burning incense, not saying prayers before the altar of Aphrodite, he's also not engaging in the very action that would honour Aphrodite. He's not even gazing longingly and lovingly at someone from afar, which would be an offering to Aphrodite. He's nothing. He's cold, he's dead, he's indifferent to human affection. Then Aphrodite puts up with it for a while. But then she finally loses her patience and curses him, turns against him, destroys him. She does so by laying a curse on Hippolytus, which also affects his stepmother, Jocasta. Now, up until this point in the story, the relationship between Jocasta and her stepson has been a fairly standard, normal, ordinary stepmother-stepchild relationship. Once the curse of Aphrodite falls, Jocasta, the stepmother, becomes obsessively in love with her stepson. She falls for him hook, line, and sinker. It's an unhinged love, a mad love. Not sighing wistfully from afar, but, well, in this day and age, we would probably call it stalking. It's that intense. And her obsession with her stepson leads to a whole succession of tragedies, like dominoes falling one after the other, until by the end of the story, and by the stage play version of the story, rather like Shakespearean tragedy, there are corpses everywhere. Everybody dies. It's just death after death after death, all of which comes about because of this obsessive romance, one-sided, unrequited romance on the part of the stepmother. And eventually Hippolytus himself dies and falls underneath the hooves of his own favourite horses, who trample him to death. One of the key features to take away from this story is that it is the stepmother who manifests the curse, the madness. And that's key to a number of ideas, not only Jung's ideas, but those of some other people as well. Virginia Satter, the woman who virtually invented family therapy in America and introduced it to the world, argued that early on in her career, she was treating usually teenage children who were brought along for therapy because they were dabbling in drugs, smashing things up, behaving aggressively or bizarrely or self-harming or doing one thing or another, that had worried their parents, and the parents had brought their kids in for therapy. And what she twigged very early on in her career was that the children, these usually teenagers, were not the only ones in the family with problems. That in fact the entire family had problems. It's just that this child was the one causing the most disruption and acting out the problems of the whole family. So her solution was to invent family therapy and say you cannot treat one person in isolation as if their problem was entirely confined to them. They are part of a nexus, a network of relationships. And in the case of a family, a very long-lasting set of relationships that's gone on for years and years and years. And the way everyone in that family interrelates to each other has helped shape and form the problems which this one particular member of the family is now manifesting. But they all have issues. So in order to solve the issues, you can't just give that one child art therapy or that one child medication. You've got to treat the whole family, which is, of course, very time-consuming, very expensive, and frequently involves a lot of resistance from members of the family who don't want to play along with it. This fits in well with Jung's argument that through the collective unconscious, we all connect to each other. My problems are not wholly my problems, because they will start to impact on other people, just as their problems will impact on me. And not only will they impact, but the very creation, the genesis, the birth of those problems will not just be confined to me as an individual, my brain chemistry or my individual family background or whatever, but be the result of an interaction between a series of people over time. Now, family therapy can also be employed in other contexts. You can have, for example, workplace dynamics, where one person in a business, a company, is suffering. Actually, Satter's approach would be to say, look at the whole team dynamic, how they all interrelate to each other. Don't just target this one person, see it as a team issue. So you can think of this in various different contexts as to how it might apply. But it's perceiving that an issue with one person may manifest as a problem for another. So Hippolytus's repressive nature manifests in the madness of his stepmother, which then tears down the whole family. So it's not seeing people in isolation, but people connected. Connected sometimes in a very positive, constructive fashion, and sometimes in a very negative, destructive fashion. How these patterns play out in families. And this element of Stone's argument, which also forms the bedrock of James Hillman's argument, who we'll get onto momentarily, around archetypal psychology, is that within us we have these presences. The great mother, the great father, the shadow, the trickster, the hero. These archetypal forces, and whether or not you see them as gods in the old-fashioned sense of the word, or you just see them as archetypes in a more modern sense, how you see them doesn't matter particularly much at this point at any rate. It's more, what's more key is what you do about it. Do you give heed to each of the gods or archetypes or whatever you want to call them that exist within you? Their needs, their demands. So there is Aphrodite, the urge for love, for romance, for sexuality, for sensuality. There is Hermes, the communicator, the speaker, the talker, the intellectual, the driving intellect that's interested in things and wants to learn about things. There is Dionysus, the urge for partying, for dissolution, for letting go and dancing on tables and losing yourself in a night of drama. There is serene Apollo, classical, cultured, sophisticated, creative, artistic. There are all these different forces. We all have the whole range of different forces. And to be a balanced individual, we must make offerings at the altar of each one. Now, there's a whole seminar to be had in discussing what those offerings would constitute in the first place. But it could be, in the religious sense that it's meant in that story of Hippolytus, going into the holy place to say prayers and burn incense and so on. Or it could be in the sense of engaging in activities. So had Hippolytus fallen in love or had sex or taken someone out to wine them and dine them, it would have given offering to Aphrodite, to the power of love. An act of creativity is an offering to Apollo, the force of creation, of artisticness. Going on a drunken bender, or if you don't drink, some other kind of dancing into the night. So you could be a whirling dervish, dancing into light, losing yourself in dance, rather than losing yourself in the bottle. There's all sorts of ways you can lose yourself for a night. Is an offering to Dionysus, the descent into darkness to be reborn in a new shape, like a phoenix arising the following day. All of these kinds of, whether it's by an activity, whether it's by simply thinking about something. So you could make a commitment to be a lifelong celibate, but nonetheless think about the role that romance has played in your life in the past and the kinds of people you're thinking of. So you don't necessarily have to go out and sort of throw yourself into things full throttle if you don't want to, but to be aware of them as part of your life and to see them as positive forces rather than as things that should be bottled up, hidden away, repressed, stamped down into the darkness. That's pretty much what the Greeks and Ira Stone and a variety of others have meant by this idea of making offerings to these godlike forces. James Hillman, we've mentioned briefly. We'll also, as we go along, make brief mention of Sylvia Brinton Pereira and her ideas and theories, and of Rollo May and his. Now, these are all people who followed on from Carl Jung. studying either directly with him or studying his writings, his teachings, developing his ideas in various different directions. So none of them, not only these three people, but a whole raft of others we could mention, none of them are saying Carl Jung was the end-all, the be-all, the great guru, and no other word may be added. Every single one of them has just said, in effect, Jung started the ball rolling, the rest of us have to keep it rolling and follow where the ideas take us. So, speaking of which, we'll follow where the ideas took Sylvia Brinton Pereira. Now, Jung tended to write from a man's perspective. He was a man, but thinking mainly from a male point of view. He wasn't being maliciously or intentionally sexist. It was just the era in which he lived. Men tended to think mainly from men's views, women tended to think mainly from women's views. There wasn't an awful lot of effort made to immerse oneself in the life, the world, the thought patterns, the emotional needs of the opposite sex. So Brinton Pereira and a whole raft of other Jungian psychologists have sat down and said to themselves, Jung's ideas apply pretty well to men. Do they also apply equally to women? And quite a few of them have come to the conclusion, no. If they don't apply equally well to women, can we come up with new ideas that do apply well for women? And so people like Brinton Pereira have written book after book after book exploring how ideas around archetypes, the collective unconscious, the individual unconscious, all the various maturational stages people go through, how do these ideas apply to the lives of women, and how can stories and myths and symbolism be used to help us understand the journey that women make through life, just as the things that Jung wrote about help men understand their journey through life. One of the stories that Sylvia went for, and she's written extensively about quite a few stories, but one to talk about here is that of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess whose image is shown in the photo in bas relief. Very striking image, and I'm sure you can read all sorts of symbolism and potential into that single image there. There are a number of aspects to the story of Inanna. We won't go over all of them because it will take forever, but one to mention. Inanna's beloved dies, and she is grief-stricken. She can't cope without him. Life is just sinking into sorrow and misery. And so she decides she will journey into the underworld to find the soul of her dead beloved and bring him back to life. But the underworld is ruled over by her sister, Ereshkigal. And Ereshkigal is not the easiest of goddesses to be getting along with, let's put it like that. She's a fierce, challenging figure in Sumerian mythology. And there's this big long story about how Inanna has to go through the underworld and pass through 7 gates and remove veils from herself, the 7 veils, and all sorts of things happen. All of which Pereira has written about and which can be understood as representing different aspects of women's experience and psychology and states of mind and so on. We could talk about this for hours alone. But eventually she gets to the royal court in the underworld, and there is her sister Ereshkigal. And the two sisters do not get on with each other. It's sort of sibling rivalry to the nth degree. And Ereshkigal is very, very dark as a character, very bitter, very resentful, very vindictive. She doesn't want to let the dead lover go back, almost as a way of getting at her sister as much as anything else. She's got his soul and she doesn't want to let go of the soul. There is a definite element of sisterly spite going on there. Like 2 children refusing to share their toys or something like that kind of. You can imagine that sort of sisterly rivalry at a human level from a very young age, getting worse and worse and worse as the 2 sisters get older and older and older. Inanna has to come to terms with her sister, has to make peace with her sister. and an agreement is reached, and eventually everything works out. But it's not an easy process. Part of the idea of having to take off the 7 veils of clothing, these sort of shimmery robes that she's wearing as she goes through each gate in the underworld, is that by the time she arrives at the royal court of her sister, she is naked. And in other words, so you can see that there's a psychological level of stripping away our barriers, our fineries, our pretenses, until we stand faced with the raw pain of Erich Kegel. And we have nothing to protect us from it. No civilization, no veneer, nothing. It's just raw pain screaming at us. And that raw pain could be caused by a death, it could be caused by 101 different things that happen to people in life. It must be faced. Now, this story has been used not only by Pereira, but it's been used by others, and some take it in the sense of very personal pain. That individual, maybe they did suffer a death, maybe they suffered some terrible disappointment or rejection. It can be often pinpointed down to some very specific thing that's happened to them that they've never fully got over, and the screaming raw pain of that wound is still deeply buried in their psyche. And so this is a journey into their own unconscious to confront the pain they've never properly dealt with. Others come at it from a more politicized perspective, a feminist perspective, to say that all women experience repression and objectification and this, that, and the other, and therefore every single woman, even if she's had a fairly calm, cushy, content life, will have had the pain that is inflicted on all women by a social system that's not terribly supportive of women, and therefore see Erich Kegel as this sort of rage of feminist ire and wrath against an oppressive system. Now, whether you understand this at a personal level, or whether you understand this at a political level, or a bit of both, or maybe something entirely different at a third level altogether, is up to you. It's your understanding of what these stories mean and how you apply them in your life, or you would apply them if maybe this is new to you and you haven't really applied it yet, but how you understand this. And so for Brinton Pereira, Erich Kegel and Inanna are not per se two separate beings. They are rather two faces of the same being. So the woman in therapy, lying on Sylvia's couch in an office somewhere as a client for therapy, when she goes into herself, her conscious mind is Inanna going into herself. When she meets the screaming wound of pain, Erich Kegel is still part of that woman. It's not some other being, some other person, someone else entirely. It's still her. So it's one bit of her meeting another bit of her, in essence. So the different goddesses or different archetypes, or however you want to understand this, are understood in the therapist's office, at least, as reflection, different facets of the same human being. Now, one thing you might want to mull over, again, pause the video, have a cup of tea or what have you. Do all women share this journey? Now, we could say, yes, this is a Sumerian myth, so maybe this reflects the life of Sumerian women. Sylvia Brinton Pereira clearly thinks it represents rather more than only Sumerian women. It represents many, many, many other women as well. So does this apply as much to American women, to British women, to Spanish women, to Zimbabwean women? Does it apply to every woman on the planet? Or is it culturally specific, where you'd have to be a woman living in a certain type of culture for this to apply to you? And so if you live in a different type of culture, a different story would apply to you. So the question of how universal is the descent into darkness becomes one of the things to consider. Another thing to consider is this idea that Pereira is arguing, because this is a story of goddesses rather than gods, this is reflective of women's psychology rather than men's psychology. Women have their stories, men have their stories. Might there be some men out there who identify with Inanna and Ereshkigal and can see this of themselves? Or is there something uniquely female about this? So, in other words, are there stories which really are peculiar to men and other stories which are peculiar to women? And you have to have the biology to have the story. Or can we mix and match it? Now, I'm talking about this all in terms of men and women, because that's the atmosphere that Sylvia Brinton Pereira was writing in back in 1981, and of course the atmosphere that people in Sumeria were understanding when they were writing down the myths and stories of Inanna and Ereshkigal and so on. 21st century Britain and Western Europe generally, it's common to talk in terms these days, or at least to think of a possibility in terms of transgender people, people who are gender queer, gender neutral, a raft of other terms that come and go, describing people who would not fit automatically into the male or the female duality. And so a question becomes, if you are a therapist and you had a client who was gender neutral or gender queer or transgender or what have you, or you yourself are, of course, do these stories apply to you in the same way? Are there stories that would be unique and particularly suited to people with a different gender identity? Or could you have a combination of some stories that were originally told of men and other stories that were originally told of women, and elements of one and elements of the other apply to you? How would you understand this? And I'm not going to give you the answers largely because I just don't know. So I'm just posing the question for you to consider where you would sit on those issues. I don't know if there is actually a right answer to any of this. It's simply a discussion to be had as to how different people with different identities, whether those identities are rooted in more biological matters such as being intersex, or whether they're rooted in more social self-identity matters. It's a whole other story. But how do we understand today how these ancient stories apply to the different needs of different times, different cultures? Now, going back to the male-female dyad, which is the one that these ideas develop within, and still probably, if you are a therapist or you're working with people in any capacity, probably the majority of the people you work with will be either male or female and relatively down the line in that way. Jung's ideas were to advance a set of four. We've mentioned that he liked sets of four. So he said there is the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. And being very heavily influenced by Greek philosophy and Greek culture, he was struck by Aristotle's notion of virtue ethics. Not only Aristotle, quite a few Greek philosophers embraced virtue ethics, but Aristotle particularly. Aristotle said that a little bit like Goldilocks and her porridge, it's either too hot, too cold, or just right. We can understand ethics as too much, too little, or just right. And Jung said we can understand these archetypes as too much, too little, or just right. So the just right king, strong, confident, fair, wise, tolerant, etc. Too little of that, you get weakness. Someone who's a bit of a doormat, who's just walked all over, very servile. Too much of all of that, you get the tyrant, the egomaniac who demands everyone else bow down in obedience towards them. And likewise, for each of these archetypes in turn, there is the too little absence of it, the too much excess of it, or the just right balance of it. This is a theme we'll return to as we go along. And so Brinton Pereira and several dozen other female Jungians said, well, that's very much a male thing. Is there a female thing to balance this out? So would it simply be that for each of the four male archetypes, there would be a comparable female archetype? And so one of the systems come up with was the queen, the mother, the wise woman, and the lover. which are pretty much the same as the male ones, just from a somewhat more female perspective. Other theorists said, well, maybe it's not just this sort of mix and match identikit, 4 for the boys and 4 for the girls. Maybe there is something more subtle and nuanced that women have that's different from what men have. So one of the people who advanced that argument, Jean Shinoda Bolen, said that there were 7, and Bolen drew upon imagery from Greek myth. He was very keen, still is very keen, as far as I know, on Greek myth, and said that there were 7 Greek goddesses that served as archetypes for female experience. And she wrote quite a few books and papers and gave talks and lectures and what have you, exploring this idea. And some of these are understood as being in balance with a male force, and some of them are understood as being quite separate in and of themselves. So as per the quote here, this one deals with a balance. The goddess Artemis had a twin brother, Apollo, the many-faceted god of the sun. He was her male counterpart. His domain was the city, hers the wilderness. His was the sun, hers the moon. His the domesticated flocks, hers the wild, untamed animals. He was the god of music, and she was the inspiration for round dances on the mountains. Which is indeed was the case, that the priestesses of Artemis would do lots of what these days we call circle dancing. These are part of their ritual celebrations for the goddess Artemis. So there you have sun and moon, wild and tamed, and so on, in counterpoint to each other. But there are others who are more self-contained and don't necessarily have a male counterpart. So it's not automatically the case that because if we follow Bolen's argument, women have 7 archetypes, therefore men have got to have 7 archetypes as well. It doesn't have to be an automatic mix and match. It may be that there are notable differences. And it does depend very much, as I said a few minutes ago, on your understanding of what gender is, how gender relates to biology. Is it a clear-cut relationship? Is it a much more subtle, nuanced relationship? How your understanding of social ideas around gender and things like changes in clothing, changes in professions that the genders are meant to do, changes in ideas about what constitutes female temperament and male temperament, how they shift and turn and change over different centuries and different cultures. All of that will help to inform your ideas if you go along with the arguments made by Jean Shinoda Bolen and others as to how women can be understood, how men can be understood, and how other people who don't necessarily fit into that dyad can be understood. Returning to the shadow, the dark and the light, the hero and the shadow, form this duality. Jung was very keen on his dualities, and he saw these dualities as ultimately moving towards reconciliation and resolution in the mature, well-balanced mind. Now, not everyone has a mature mind, and some people go to their graves dying of old age never having had a mature mind or a well-balanced mind. So it's not an automatic given that simply because you're alive, eventually you'll get this balance. It doesn't automatically follow. So it's something that has to be striven for, something that has to be attained. To bring together that which you keep hidden with that which you are happy to show to the public and gain approval for and gain positive response for. Now, it is sometimes the case that things we keep bottled up for fear of what the neighbours might say might not cause any bad response from the neighbours at all. They might not be shocked by it. They may indeed quite like it, perhaps. Sometimes. And so it does sometimes become the case that a person who works on their shadow side, who addresses these repressed elements of themselves, one day has that kind of penny dropping experience where they go, oh, that thing I've kept repressed all these years, I needn't have bothered keeping repressed because actually the neighbours aren't shocked by it. And it becomes public, it becomes mainstream, it becomes just an everyday element of themselves. That sometimes happens. There are other occasions when probably the neighbours always will be shocked by that part of yourself, and it may be a part of yourself you do decide to keep contained within certain very specific parameters for your safety, for other people's safety, so as not to end up in court, or whatever it may be, depending on the nature of your shadow. So it's not necessarily that embracing the shadow instantaneously leads it to becoming a positive, upbeat, jolly thing. That's not necessarily the case. It's simply that no matter how grim, how dark, how bleak that shadow self is, to be a rounded individual, you have to work with it. Now, some people have argued that this shadow self is at least partly our animalistic self. And there are lots of sort of fairy tales and myths and legends and what have you, where the hero goes off on an adventure and they meet a talking animal who helps them. Or they meet some kind of rather monstrous figure who, after a few tussles, becomes their friend and helps them. And this has led to some psychologists, at least, to speculate that what that animal self, that bestial dark self, is, at least partially at any rate, is our own survival instincts, going all the way back to the days when we lived in caves. People who were too soft and gentle and fluffy got eaten by saber-toothed tigers. They didn't last very long. You needed a certain edge to survive, a willingness to defend yourself from aggressive people, a willingness to fight off wild animals, or indeed hunt wild animals, bash them over the head and kill them and eat them. You had to be prepared to do fairly harsh things in order to survive. And that's been true for most of human history. And indeed, up until the invention of supermarkets and dead animals in shrink-wrapped plastic, it's persisted to be true for most of the world, where life frequently still to this very day is very harsh. Not necessarily just in far-flung places with war zones, but there's plenty of places in this country, or very rough estates and all sorts of places, where to survive, you would need a certain degree of street smarts, a certain willingness to face down anyone who threatens you. Because if you don't, they will do horrible things to you. So even now, we still have this need for this survival side of ourselves, the red in tooth and nail side of ourselves. And that's something which the Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson argues, that people need their dark side, they need their edge, because if you find someone who doesn't appear to have an edge, they will not be able to survive very long. They'll be walked all over, used, abused, trodden into the ground. You need that part of you which stands up and says, no, enough, I am not putting up with this, and not necessarily gets violent, but is willing to stand its ground. Even if that means having a slanging match, even if that means taking some very forceful, assertive action that might upset someone else. Because if you don't do that, you will be walked all over by the harsher people in this world. And so there's that sense of needing the darkness within. So if you are interested either in improving the quality of your own life, or you are professionally or amateurly involved in helping improve the quality of other people's lives, it doesn't have to be therapy in the traditional sense. There's all sorts of ways in which you could be helping somebody's life. How do you go about these things? Well, first off, you start with self-reflection and observation. And to understand that there are all these different forces within yourself, these archetypes, but also to understand that you are not entirely the archetype. You partake of it just as every other person on the planet does, but you are also somewhat separate from it. So you can move in and out of it. Because if you start to identify too much with the archetype, it will overwhelm you. That's an experience which Rollo May, whose photo I showed you earlier, considers a very dangerous thing to happen. He likes to use the word daimon, which comes from the ancient Greek. The daimones were the guardian spirits, who each represented a very strong emotion or a life experience, like love and hope and hate and fear. They were sort of single note beings. They weren't good or bad, they simply existed. The word daimon did in time lead to the modern English word demon. So it's taken on this very nasty, sinister quality to it. But in Greek terms, it was a neutral presence. Even the daimons associated with nice things like love could be dangerous if they overpowered you. They were kind of like, I suppose, think of it a bit like a tiger or a lion, very beautiful to admire from afar, but you wouldn't want necessarily to get too close because it would probably eat you. So there is a sort of a power to the daimon, this intense emotional force, this intense psychic constellation within the unconsciousness, but better admired from afar rather than too up close. Jung was of the opinion that most of us go through life largely asleep. We do obviously actually spend quite a chunk of time asleep. But even when we're awake, he said we frequently just kind of drift into this slightly trance-like state where we're on autopilot and aren't really paying much attention to what's going on around us. Especially if you've got a really boring job or a really boring relationship, and it's all so repetitive and humdrum and same old, you'll switch off very rapidly and just drift through life. And that's not a good thing. Jung said we should strive to achieve a degree of engagement with life. I'm trying to avoid using the word awake because that puts people in mind of woke politics, which is a whole other ballgame. What Jung was talking about wasn't that. It was simply the sense that you are conscious, you're making decisions, you're doing things because you want to do them and they seem the right thing to do at the time. You are engaged with life, not just drifting and wafting in this vague, nebulous cloud of unknowing. That's what he wanted people to move towards engagement. Now, he said there's these two big stages in life that are worth paying attention to. When you're a teenager, or usually a teenager, I suppose it does possibly depend on different cultures, maybe do this at slightly different points in time. But usually in the West, it's being a teenager. You start to pull away from mum and dad. You start to think your own thoughts. So yes, they may have very strong views on politics and religion and favourite TV shows and favourite music and this, that, and that. But as a teenager, you start to try and establish your own identity and find your own music, your own favourite TV shows, your own political views, your own ideas and religion and everything else going, and to establish individualism, or at least what we think is individualism. Clearly, it's very easy just to go from identifying with your parents to identifying with your friends and being just as sheep-like in following their facts. So when we think we're being individualistic, we aren't necessarily succeeding in that, so we need to be careful there. And then we get to roughly the age of 40, and what at one point in time was considered midlife crisis, although midlife does depend on average lifespan, which changes over time. But round about middle age, anyway, whenever you want to think of that as being. We've done the teenage bit, pulled away from our parents, we've had our own home, perhaps, hopefully, got a job, hopefully, formed new friends, formed romances and relationships, hopefully, maybe have had kids of our own. We've done all that, and it's getting to the point where those kids are themselves becoming teenagers and gradually becoming independent. And the whole being a mum or dad is no longer the centre of our lives because the kids are growing up, they don't need us to the same extent. that they used to need us. It's changing. They're spending more time off doing their own thing rather than in our company all the time. And just as they are redefining themselves, so we have to start redefining ourselves. And as far as Jung was concerned, true wisdom is not going to be achieved until you're the other side of the midlife crisis. So one of the few benefits of being the other side of 40 is that you might start to find yourself in a truly meaningful sense, not as some stroppy rebellion against your parents, where you come home with piercings and purple hair and think you're being terribly individualistic, even though you look exactly like every other bugger with purple hair and piercings. But in a spiritually aware sense. Now, it's not an automatic thing. You reach 40, you change, and that's done. You can reach 40 and screw it all up. But it's an opportunity to find yourself and to start not pulling away from society, kicking against it, rebelling against it, having a big hissy fit about it, because everything's awful, right, isn't it? It doesn't have to be all of that. Although I'm sure there are some 40-year-olds who go and do exactly that. I can think of a few of that. What it is a chance to rejoin society, not as a underpaid drudge, exhausted, tired, bored, wondering what the hell it's all about, but as an engaged, alert, aware, constructive person who is not trying to rip society down, but trying to improve society. And improving society by first improving themselves, which is very much an idea to be found in Taoism and Shinto and various other traditions, where you start by improving yourself. That then leads as a kind of a domino ripple out to improve the wider world. So whereas maybe when you're 17, you're shouting at the world as everyone else is terrible and stupid and all feeling they've got it wrong, when you're 40, you're less interested in shouting at people and more interested in helping people, perhaps. And so that's where this process of reintegration begins. And there are various different processes to go through. Now, some of these can happen before you're 40, but others tend to happen, especially the bottom one. The Mysterium Conjunctionis tends to happen after 40. You might get to your midlife and have your crisis and feel that you're losing your identity as your kids get off hand, if you ever had kids in the first place, that is, or your job's changing, or you're contemplating possible retirement in the not so distant future anymore, and considering all those issues that are happening to you, as your body changes and hormonal changes, this, that, and the other, you start to think about the big issues in life. And you might find that you've become very overbalanced. Jung felt that probably most people would find they'd got very imbalanced in life. And a process can start kicking into your life, which can happen earlier than the midlife crisis, but becomes more pronounced as the midlife crisis gets into full swing, called an anhedonia. Now, in each person, there is this balance of forces. Jung spoke about there being 4 personality types: the thinking and the feeling, which exist in opposition to each other, the sensation and the intuitive, and those two exist in opposition to each other, as well as the light and the dark, the male and the female, and all these other things we've mentioned previously. All these things that exist in pairs and in balance. So you can have too much of one and hardly any of the other. And that's not good in the long term. You can survive that in the short term, but it's not good in the long term. What you need is balance, integration. And so what starts to happen? Well, within anhedonia, because we are not isolated individuals, we are part of this greater collective, life responds to us by prodding us in ways that make us pay more attention to the bit of ourselves that we have ignored. So someone who is very much a thinking person, who has spent most of their life ignoring the feeling function in their own soul, will start to find that the feeling function becomes problematic in their life through the process of anhedonia. It's like a dog on the other side of the door, scratching and scratching and scratching to be let in. How does that happen in real terms? Well, one of the ways it happens is that you might meet more and more people who very much embody the opposite pole that you have kept repressed. They are, just as you are very extreme in this direction, they're very extreme in the opposite direction. And they'll probably drive you crackers. They will be so annoying, so difficult to understand, so consistently stupid and awful and unpleasant that they will really, really get under your skin. And just like that practical exercise from earlier, when they really, really get under your skin and you find yourself breathing columns of steam like some cartoon bull in a Tom and Jerry cartoon, that's when you've got to ask yourself, what is it about this person that is too much like me, that it's making me this angry, this annoyed, this fed up? From Jung's point of view, that person is all the things you have failed to come to terms with in yourself. And it's only by coming to terms with them in yourself, so it's not coming to terms with Joe Bloggs, who's just some annoying person standing in the corner. Joe Bloggs is there to be the grit getting under your skin. And it's the grit that you need to deal with, not Joe Bloggs in and of himself. He's just a reminder, like a post-it note on two legs, reminding you to do something about yourself. So we'll take the example I've just given, someone who's very, very thinking function and very little feeling function. What is the thinking function? It's someone who is very intellectual, probably very logical, very rational, very calm, very calculating in how they think about the world. They could probably make a really good researcher or scientist or something like that because they've got a very good logical mind, probably a fantastic engineer. But all the emotional warmth of an iceberg. Ask them what they feel about something, and there'll be a long, awkward pause whilst they look at you and think, what the hell are you on about? Feel? What is this thing called feeling? If you say, oh, tell me how you feel today, they possibly won't know what to say to you because they don't really know what they feel today because they never think about their feelings. They have them, they just don't think about them. They're not an interesting topic of conversation or an interesting topic of quiet contemplation. And so they reach their midlife crisis. Who are they going to meet? They're going to meet lots of highly emotional people they probably dismiss as being ludicrous drama queens, flailing their arms around and bursting into tears every time they see pictures of kittens and puppies and being all very hormonal and very over the top. This is an Anshadramia. The highly intellectual person meets the highly emotional person. Neither of them like each other. Neither of them can relate to each other. Neither of them understand each other because both of them have failed to come to terms with that bit of themselves. The intellectual hasn't come to terms with their emotions. The highly emotional person hasn't come to terms with their intellect. They've ignored it and neglected it and dodged the bullet. And this golden opportunity is for both of them to come to terms with that bit of themselves and to achieve a greater balance, to no longer be this cold, cold fish who can't say a nice thing to anyone because they've got no emotional warmth, or to no longer be this gushing, sentimental ocean that's incapable of organising the proverbial in a brewery because they can't follow logical thought or remember much of anything or focus on much of anything. So then there needs to be balance for both parties. And that's not achieved by them being all huggy and cuddly with one another necessarily, because what they really need to do is go away and work on themselves. But they can take lessons from the other person. They can start to see the positives in the other person. That maybe they're not the horrible cold fish they look, or the over-dramatic ocean of emotion that they look, they can start to see more positive features of that person as gradually they start to better balance out their own inner psyche. And equally, in terms of other forms of imbalance, it can happen in this way. Now, synchronicity is again to do with this merging between the inner self and the outer world, that they're not totally different things, that they overlap. Synchronicity is when things happen that we say, oh, wasn't that an amazing coincidence? As far as Jung is concerned, no, it wasn't. It happened for a reason. It happened to make a point that you needed to pay attention to. When we make decisions in harmony with our own nature, and this is something that James Hillman talks about, then events in life fall into place. Synchronicitous events happen. And everything seems to be going in the right direction because it is, because we're making the right decisions. And equally, when we make the wrong decisions, things fall out of place. They become asynchronous, discordant, chaotic. Nothing feels right, nothing works right, nothing goes right. Because we need that balance, that harmony, that sense of flow to be achieved. And so you keep an eye open for the synchronicities, because when happy coincidences happen, you know you're going in the right direction, because the outer world is reflecting your inner world of sensible decisions and harmony and going in the right way. Now, having spoken about people who are too much one thing, not enough another, another way of understanding this is inflation and deflation. Rollo May mentioned this idea of diamonds, of someone who falls into the grip of an intense psychic cluster in their own unconsciousness and finds it very difficult to get out of it, feels almost trapped by it. That is what Jung calls inflation. Somebody who makes contact with an archetype, and it's a little bit like putting your fingers in a plug socket. It's so overwhelming, individuality is lost. And that person forgets they can be something other than the one trick pony, the one diamond or the one archetype, that one pattern of behavior, as if that's all they can ever be, that one thing. And they lose all sight of themselves as this much more complex being. So there is that need to avoid that kind of overwhelming sensation. So you could have someone, we'll stick with the earlier example, where we're talking about the Great Mother. Let's say you've had someone who has made such an intense link to the mother archetype that it's overwhelmed them, it's inflated them. And then one day their children are 16 or 17 and they're talking about going to university and leaving home and getting a job and doing this and doing that. And the mother, and this could equally apply to a man with the Great Father archetype, panics. What will I do when I don't have my children to look after? To cook for and clean for and fetch for and ferry around and do this for and do that for, where their whole life has been so eaten up with being a parent, there's hardly been time to do anything else or be anything else, and they can no longer remember what life is like when you don't have to be parenting every minute of every day. Now, there's several things they can do. They can have a massive breakdown and a crisis, which Jung said, as did indeed the Scottish therapist Lang, can actually be a good thing. Sometimes a breakdown can be a breakthrough, and they can rebuild afresh from the other side. Or they might try to extend the experience by trying to undermine their children and prevent them from leaving home. Oh, you'll be useless at college. Don't go to university, you won't cope. Stay at home, stay at home. So they'll do things positive, kind of smother love, and things negative, criticism, undermining them, destroying their self-confidence to stop the child from leaving home. And it's not for the good of the child, it's for the good of the parent who just cannot imagine what they will do when they are no longer mum or dad 24 hours a day. Now, I'm sure for anyone listening to this who's had children in that age group, You're aware that even once they have left home, they'll still phone you up and email you and all the rest of it. So you don't lose contact entirely. But clearly, the amount of time you spend parenting a 5-year-old compared to the amount of time you spend parenting a 35-year-old is significantly different. Changes quite dramatically. And that's the fear. Not that they will never be a parent again, but that they will have too much time on their hands where they're not parenting, and they have absolutely no idea what to do with that time because they cannot imagine themselves as anything other than a parent. You get a similar thing with, and it does seem to be more of a problem for men than women in terms of the death rates of men who die within 2 years of retirement. One of the arguments as to why quite such a large number of men die within 2 years of retirement is that a lot of men have no idea what the hell to do with themselves once they've retired. They've spent so many decades at a job that when they don't do it anymore, they just don't do anything. They sit there and pretty much lose the will to live. The key, it's often argued, to a really good retirement is to have plans of what to do, not just to sit there doing nothing but watching telly, but to have constructive plans of what you'll do instead when you are no longer working at whatever that job was that you used to do. Likewise, to cope with empty nest syndrome, what will you do when the kids are offhand? What are your constructive plans, as opposed to floundering around panicking? Deflation is when that overwhelming sense of the great mother, the great father, whatever it may be, begins to decrease and decrease, and it can reach a point of harmony, and that's great. But the risk is that it will continue to deflate and deflate and deflate until there's nothing left of it at all. And the person's lost all contact with that part of themselves, that archetype, and they no longer know how to make contact with it when life requires them to make contact with it. It's gone in the opposite direction. The ideal balance, the Goldilocks bit, not too hot, not too cold, just right, is the mysterium conjunctionis, when the various complementary parts of the personality come together in harmonious balance, and we're a well-rounded human being rather than being a one-trick pony. Needless to say, that takes a lot of time, effort, and therapy, and not many people achieve it. And when they do achieve it, it's usually many decades into their life before they really get to that state. Give a couple of examples of people who might be considered as overwhelmed. Hopefully, many of you will recognize Jeremy Brett, the actor in the top picture, dressed as Sherlock Holmes in the top hat. Fantastic actor. Having done many, many roles in his life, he was cast as Sherlock Holmes and did it so brilliantly, lived the part so intensely, real kind of method acting type stuff, that he started to suffer mental illness problems as a result of this, particularly when his wife died. So it was a combination of the grief at his wife's death with his intense submersion in this theatrical role. Part of the time he spent in mental hospitals was trying to rediscover himself, to kind of separate Sherlock Holmes from Jeremy Brett, so he could put on the Sherlock Holmes hat and costume and do the role in front of the cameras, and then take it off and go home and be Jeremy Brett again. Because he'd reached the point in his life where he'd lost sight of Jeremy Brett, and he was sort of being Sherlock Holmes even when he was at home, and it became overwhelming. And sometimes that does happen with actors. It happens also with other sorts of people who become overwhelmed by a role they're playing to the point where they can't remember how to take it off anymore. And it becomes suffocating. And they start to feel hollow. Lang referred to it as a sense of implosion, as if there's nothing in the middle, because they've lost sight of what was in the middle. The quote from Jung there about traitors to the selves we thought we were, is that there can be a positive experience coming out of the sense of being overwhelmed by an impulse or an urge or a psychic constellation. In that once you've recovered from it, you can rebuild yourself and discover a new version of you, which is better than the version of you that was damaged and destroyed in this experience of being overwhelmed and eaten up and spat out. Doesn't work for everyone. So poor old Vincent van Gogh perhaps is someone for whom it didn't work, where that intense creative mania, when he would burn himself to exhaustion with his creative drives, painting for hours and hours and hours and hours, and then collapsing in a heap at the end of it. Obviously, he went to his grave one-eared and mentally scarred, emotionally scarred, never having quite got all of his psychological complexes into balance. They just ate him up and did indeed spit him out, and he didn't recover to find that good, happy place again at the end of it. It's what Richard Diamond calls dystomonia, that sense of being overwhelmed and never quite recovering yourself from these destructive complexes and urges. James Hillman, who I showed you earlier, talks about acorn theory and says that we're born with this blueprint, this acorn, for what we're going to be in life. Now, you can understand this through the lens of nurture or of nature, or, which is Hillman's addition, the third option of soul. Nature is biology. You can talk about someone in terms of their genetic predispositions, their neurostructure, their neurochemistry, giving them predispositions to be very aggressive and very calm, to be very sexualized or hardly sexual at all, to have all of these sorts of different qualities and traits about them. You can understand that in a very kind of biological sense. Are we born to follow certain genetic predispositions? Well, genetically we are predisposed to certain hair color, certain skin color, certain eye color. Can we argue the same about personality and temperament? Increasingly we are doing so to a greater or lesser extent. Can we understand human nature in terms of nurture? That we are the way we are because of how we were brought up as children. Freud's argument. Those first 5-6 years of life when you have very little control over what goes on in the world and things are done to you or done for you, does that shape the adult you will be for the remainder of your life, those big environmental forces? Now, the critical issue here, from Hillman's point of view, is that both nature and nurture tend to treat the human being as a puppet. We're either a puppet of our biology or we're a puppet of our childhood upbringing and the kind of environmental forces that go on around us, which you can extend into adulthood. So we might talk about subliminal advertising causing adults to buy certain products or vote certain ways or whatever, and then barely being aware that they are being influenced by these sinister environmental forces. So it's not only just childhood, it can be adulthood too. But again, the person is almost like a puppet at the mercy of other forces. Hillman's argument for this third option of soul is free will, individualism. We are born with a soul that will lead us to flower in certain ways, and it's up to us quite how we flower it. We are not totally at the mercy of our biology. We are not totally at the mercy of our upbringing and our environmental forces. We have the power for choice and change and instigating things that we want. At least that's Hillman's argument at any rate. To return to the acorn analogy a little bit, an acorn will always be an oak tree. It won't turn into a holly bush, it won't turn into an ash tree, it won't turn into a hawthorn tree or a hazel tree, it will only ever turn into an oak tree. So the range of choice, what can that acorn be, is limited, which you could argue maybe represents nature-nurture, the limitation. But that oak tree could grow to be 120 feet tall and live for 900 years. It could be this massive nurturing force in the forest, striking awe in everyone who sees it. Or it could be some shriveled up little bonsai in a plant pot that never gets bigger than 4 or 5 inches, tiny little wizened thing. They're both oak trees. So even though the oak tree can only be an oak tree, the acorn can only be an oak tree, Whether it becomes a bonsai or a mighty oak is a separate issue. And so Hillman's argument is that the blueprint of our souls, this acorn within us, says we will grow up to be this type of a tree. But that doesn't preclude the power of choice, of decision making, yes, of environmental forces, yes, of biological forces. He's not denying them, but he's saying that our capacity to choose is far greater than the impact of biology and environment. So the person who grows up to be a great brain surgeon and save 1,000 lives using their intellectual skills and their capacity for emotional self-control, not to get panicked when in the surgical theatre, their compassion and all of the other skills and abilities and qualities and traits required of a great surgeon, could potentially also involve the same set of skills, qualities, traits, could predispose someone, well, not even predispose, that's the wrong word entirely, could lead someone to becoming a serial killer. So one person uses the scalpel to be a great surgeon and the other uses it to torture and maim and dismember their victims. One is the wizened, stunted little bonsai, one is the great, mighty, magnificent oak. So that if you like, there are a range of possible versions of us. Each one of us could be something massive and beautiful and magnificent, or something wizened and stunted and gnarled. Part of it is biology, part of it is environment, but the majority of it, Hillman argues at any rate, is personal choice. The decisions we face, the choices we make, and it's lots of little choices that build up into bigger and bigger and bigger choices and patterns in life. Part of what it starts with, the whole process of self-awareness, is working out whether you are an acorn or whether you are an ash key or a hawthorn berry or what it is you are on the inside. What kind of a tree are you? And then deciding in the range of possibilities from A to Z, which one of these possibilities do you want to invest your energy, your decisions, your choices in becoming? Because you could be the most horrific version of you or the most lovely version of you or something floating in the middle. And that's the nature of free choice. So not everyone can be everything, but you can be a range of things, and it's down to you to decide which of that array of possibilities you want to become. And so the therapist, the counselor, the good friend, the priest, the vicar, the rabbi, the whoever it is that's advising and helping someone, part of what they're doing is trying to kind of draw out from that person a sense of what they are, what their range of possibilities could be, and then assisting them to become, hopefully, one of the better ones that they make their choice to become. Same for parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, etc. So it's a move towards something positive. On the road to something positive, Rollo May says we encounter, it's not all beer and skittles and jolly jolly. Sometimes we encounter a dark side, and sometimes quite frequently. Some of the darkness we encounter is guilt. And Rollo May talks about ontological guilt, guilt about the nature of reality, the nature of ourselves and our place in reality, and how we learn to tackle that guilt, influencing how we get on in life, how well we do or badly we do. Some of that guilt, uses these German terms, Umwelt, stems from the struggles we have with the world and our role in the world and how we relate to the world and engage with the world and the other people involved. He says that Umwelt was a lot less of a problem a few hundred years ago than it is nowadays, because technology, particularly internet technology, computer technology, cyber technology, has massively increased the problems and barriers in the nature of Umwelt by making it much harder to relate to the world, because you can see this with so many people in so many different age groups walking along, glued to their phones or mobile devices and barely noticing anyone else around them. If any one of you has lots of teenagers, or you teach, or some kind of job bringing you into contact with the young, you can frequently see these slightly odd situation where you've got a group of a dozen kids all within spitting distance of each other, not one of them talking to the others. They're all glued to their devices and ignoring the kids they're amongst, talking to whoever it is they're talking to on their devices. That's kind of umwelt, submerging yourself in barriers between you and the people of the world you're actually in, and just kind of immersing yourself in all of these weird escapes from reality, and then feeling bad about it afterwards. So the umwelt is the feeling bad about it afterwards, realizing that you're not engaged, but also perhaps not knowing how to be engaged. Jaron Lanier says a lot of these devices are designed intentionally, quite deliberately, to be addictive, to utilize the limbic system and the brain reward system to encourage us to become hooked on them. Every time the thing bleeps at us, or we get a like, or whatever it may be, that's part of the addictive process. So quite difficult to break away from these things and re-engage with our immediate environment and the people and the creatures and the plants and the trees and everything else in the immediate environment. You could say that protesting about saving the environment is fantastic, but you might want to actually engage with the environment occasionally, which would mean that we all of us, whatever age group, get more engaged with the environment instead of just immersing ourselves in a phone or a laptop or a TV screen or whatever it is we can immerse ourselves in. Midwelt emerges in our relationships, not just romantic relationships, any kind of a relationship, where we fail to understand the other person we are in a relationship with, whether it's a lover, a friend, a relative, whatever they are. You don't get them. Perhaps we don't spend enough time with them to get them in the first place. So we don't understand their point of view. Quite possibly they don't understand ours either. And so it often feels like you're talking at cross purposes. You don't get them, they don't get you. You don't enjoy the things that they enjoy, they don't enjoy the things that you enjoy. And so the relationship is very frustrating, it's very unfulfilling, it's very depressing and pointless. And you know it, and they know it, and neither of you are happy, and neither of you know what the hell to do about it. It can be resolved, just as umwelt can be resolved, but it requires a lot of conscious thought, conscious effort, possibly therapy, but making a real conscious effort to connect to the world and to other people and to listen, and genuinely listen, not just yeah, whatever, dear, type listening, but genuine listening and understanding. You don't have to agree with them. You might listen to them and still think they're wrong, but to at least see where they're coming from. And finally, Eigenwelt is something we all have. May says we can't get away from it. It's endemic to existence because none of us lived 100% to our full potential. Some of us might live 90%, some of us might live 3%, some of us in the middle. Different points in your life, it could go up and it will go down. Eigenwelt is the guilt that builds up from realizing you're letting yourself down, you're not living the life you could be living. It's not all as wonderful as it could be. You're not as wonderful as you could be. You know it, and you struggle to improve it. It can be the sort of the rod, the goad that gets the donkey moving a bit faster, and you make more of an effort and more of an effort. But even if you're making your maximum effort, you're never going to be 100% because you can't be. At least Rene says you can't be at any rate. And so there's always that sense of something not quite there that should be there, something missing that's not quite achieved, and might wish to have more and do better and be better. But it might, if you respond to it well, it might motivate you to do better. John Rowan, who is also within this sort of Jungian type of tradition, although he sort of branches out into other areas, talks about polypsychism, that we are not one being with one soul, one mind, one consciousness. We are a gestalt being. that has many dimensions to it, many personalities to it, many archetypes and forces within it. What he refers to as sub-personalities, and that's a subject that could fill hours in and of itself. We are all of these different bits and pieces moving in and out of control of our body, and the healthy person is aware of all their different versions of themselves and can flow and switch at will between the different versions of yourself. The unwell person, the damaged person, is no longer in control and doesn't understand how to make the changes anymore, and maybe doesn't even realise that some bits of them are bits of them. They're in a state of denial, which in very extreme cases can lead to full-on fugue and blacking out and not remembering what you're doing, but that's quite rare. So you give a sort of a small-scale example of this. You could be you could be Mr. Smith when you go to work, Mr. Smith, and you dress a certain way and you behave a certain way and you treat people a certain way and you talk about certain subjects that are appropriate for the office or the factory or the shop or wherever it is you work. And you are Mr. Smith, that is you, at that time. And then maybe you go down the pub and you are Johnny to your mates. And again, you perhaps dress slightly differently down the pub than you do when you're at work, and you talk about different subjects, and you use all sorts of language and terms and behaviours that you would never use at work, and you become a different person. And then maybe you go home to the wife or husband or whoever it is that you go home to, and you're John. And you're different again. You talk about different things, you do different things, you discuss different things, you relate to the world differently. And maybe sometimes you're Uncle John, and you behave very differently towards your nephews and nieces than you would towards anyone else. Hopefully nicely. So you've got all of these different bits of yourselves. Mr. Smith, Johnny, John, Uncle John, all these different versions of you. They have their own names. Maybe they dress a little differently, where in each different sort of social circumstance and scenario, talk about different subjects, use different tones of voice, mix with different people. And it can be a bit weird when worlds clash, when people from work meet you pushing a supermarket trolley around with the other half, and they're surprised because you seem so very different to the person they're used to at work. This is Rowan's idea of these are kind of different people who all share a body and take turns running that body and have their, say, different styles of dress, different names, slightly different names perhaps, different language frames, to use Wittgenstein's argument about the way in which we play language games, and the way in which we play language games and use language in a different way when we're being different people. And so if you're healthy, you're in charge of this, you control the process of change. If you're unhealthy, you might find it very hard to turn certain bits of yourself off, like poor old Jeremy Brett, or certain bits of yourself on, or maybe you are in denial that some parts of you are even you. And it becomes very fractious and very difficult and very strange. And so you have those nice, quiet people who get behind the wheel of a car and turn into screaming, swearing psychopaths, or go online and are being the most vile, horrible, obnoxious bullies imaginable. But meet them in real life and they're sweet and nice and jolly. Is one the real them and the other the fake them? Well, John Rowan would say they're both real. They're just real at different times. And you have to understand that the individual is very big and very complex and very sophisticated and cannot be restricted to some nice, neat, simplistic description that says, oh, they're only ever the way I see them being. It's much bigger, much more complex than that. And so, again, with that little quote there from Hellman, that we are no longer single beings in the image of a single God, but are always constituted of multiple parts, impish child, hero or heroine, supervising authority, asocial psychopath, and so on. So the same person can be all of those things at different points in time, in different situations, different circumstances, we chop, we change, we develop. And sometimes in very extreme ways that we ourselves never imagined would happen. So come the day when Mr. Smith the baker, who's nice and quiet and jolly, discovers that there's a war raging, the country goes to war, and Mr. Smith gets conscripted into the army and trained up and given a gun and sent out to kill people, and ends up doing things that Mr. Smith the baker never imagined in a million years he'd be capable of doing, because he was never in that situation beforehand. That part of him had never emerged. Did it even exist in the first place? Would be a speculation. Can new bits of us be created as circumstances and situations demand them to come into existence in order to survive and in order to cope? No clear answers to any of that, but questions to think about. And so, closing towards the end, a little poetry from the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, who I recommend, incidentally. One line from one of his poems: "In every corner of my soul there is an altar to a different god." That we are these complex beings filled with multiple, well, call them gods, call them archetypes, call them psychic constellations, call them whatever on earth you want to call them. The word doesn't desperately matter very much, but all of these presences within us, these urges, these impulses, these demands, these drives. And if you are wise, like Fernando Pessoa, you make offerings to each one. You tend to the needs of them all. You don't make the mistake that Hippolytus did of trying to repress them and deny them and frustrate them and drive them into oblivion, because they won't go away. They will just come back and bite you in the proverbial and ruin your life. They will tear you to pieces in a bid to be recognized and noticed. So Hippolytus, who didn't want love in his life, suddenly found the most obsessive, psychotic kind of love coming into his life from probably the very last person he'd ever want it from, his own stepmother. It would be acknowledged, just not in the way it might nicely and positively have been acknowledged had he integrated love into his life in the first place. It comes in kicking, screaming, howling, damaged and damaging, as something dark and deadly and dangerous. So there is this need for balance, whether we're talking love or anger or intellect or dissolution, desire, whatever qualities we're talking about, they all need acknowledgement and balancing, or at least this is Jung's approach, that these archetypal forces are there and will have their due. And the wise man or wise woman gives the due willingly. The fool has it ripped from them in the most painful way going, but it will be taken. Which brings us, thankfully, from my lungs and your ears to the end. If you've got any questions, and obviously if this was a normal seminar, we'd have been chatting throughout and bouncing ideas back and forth, but it's not a normal seminar. So if you have any questions about Jung or Hillman or any of the other people we've mentioned, you can email me, robin.hearn@wsc.ac.uk, and at some point over the summer holiday, I will endeavour to respond to you and get back to you with either a direct answer or at least a recommendation for a book or something you could read to find your answers in. There will be other seminars taking place next academic year, starting in September and going onwards. Some of those seminars, touch wood, will be held in person in a good old-fashioned way once the whole coronavirus situation is under control. And others will be online. Now, the online ones, partly that is a response to the coronavirus situation, but even if there is a cure found next Thursday, nonetheless, it's been noted by not only West Suffolk College, but pretty much all academic institutions in the country, that there is a demand for accessing services online for people who are working and can't get to these events when they're happening in person, or they live too far away, or they're unwell, or any one of 100 other things that might prevent them from getting to some events, and therefore having at least some events take place online much broadens the range of people who can participate in them. And so even if we get the miracle cure for coronavirus, there will still be some events online as well as the ones in real time. And so if you would like to be on the mailing list, let me know if you're not already, and I'll add your name to the mailing list as to what next year's topics will be about. Thank you.